to Minority Rights Group International's March 2011 podcast. This month, we hear about how minorities are affected by the exploitation of natural resources in their communities, learn about how Dalit children are disadvantaged at school by caste discrimination in India, and travel to the Balkans to listen to a rousing Romani brass band. The Unrepresented Nations and Peoples Organisation joined forces with MRG recently at the UN Minorities Forum to bring attention to widespread violations of minority rights through natural resource development projects. Here, Mark Latimer, director of MRG, speaks about the exploitation of natural resources in minority communities without their consent, strongly stating that it is nothing short of outright theft.
Many minority communities in many countries around the world are poor, and in some cases they are the poorest of the poor, because what they own has been stolen from them. And I think it's important to just clarify that we don't use that term rhetorically or as a metaphor in the same way that, for example, you might say minorities have had their future stolen from them, or minorities have had their rights stolen from them, although those two things would also be true. It's important to say that that term is meant literally. Minorities in many countries are so impoverished because what they own, the land that they have owned, in many cases for centuries, and the natural resources that that land gives up, has been stolen. How has this happened? How can it be? Well, the first problem is one that I know is familiar to many of you, and that is the question of formal title. In many cases, minorities and indigenous peoples have inhabited lands for decades, if not centuries, but they don't necessarily have a piece of paper. They don't have the title registered in a formal book to prove their ownership over that land. In many cases, this has become the pretext for taking it away from them. Now, there has been a movement in recent years in countries as diverse as Australia and Nicaragua to ensure that the customary held land rights held through customary law by minorities and indigenous peoples, are recognised by governments and in the international legal system. I think it is now widely recognised that you don't have to have a piece of paper if you can prove possession over many, many years. But yet, many minorities continue to be dispossessed. And although we are familiar with that problem, I think principally in terms of indigenous peoples, it's important to say that it is not just indigenous peoples who are affected. Whether it's members of minorities returning after the war in the former Yugoslavia who can't get their homes or their farms back because the paperwork has been taken away from them or never existed after the reforms, after the fall of the communist system. Whether it's rural populations in many countries where the formal title to land simply doesn't exist, they too are affected. In Iraq at the moment, possibly the most dangerous position lies in the north over the increasing conflict over control of oil resources around the city of Kirkuk. Now, because of their importance in the new administration, the Kurds will probably start to benefit for the first time in Iraq's recent history from oil. But representatives of other communities, who in some cases have lived in those lands in the north for over 4 millennia, the Assyrians, the Turkmen, representatives told me that they fear that they will not benefit at all. So that brings me to the second problem. The fact that it's not just because they don't have formal title. Many communities have their lands and the natural resources stolen from them simply because they are minorities. They are in a weak or vulnerable enough position that governments, foreign corporations can take away what they have, knowing that they will not have the power to get it back. Now, I know you're all familiar with what is now known as the resource curse, the fact that some states who are lucky enough to have found oil or gas or rich mineral resources have nonetheless not benefited from human development through mismanagement of those resources and through foreign exploitation. Well, minorities and indigenous peoples suffer from their own version of the resource curse. And in many cases, the discovery of rich mineral resources, of oil on their lands, is not the start of their economic development, but the start of their dispossession. Last year, I spoke to a senior member of the government in North Kivu in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I went to see him about the fact that the Bambuti community had been refused access to the forests where they've hunted for centuries. He said to me, but as you know, it's now a park, it's a reserve. There are many important mineral concessions that we are currently thinking about letting. They can't go into the forest. You have to realize the forest now belongs to everyone. And that use of the word everyone, which clearly did not include the minorities, is very interesting and very typical. But there is also a third and final problem that I'd like to talk about, and that partly is our own problem, our own fault as human rights activists. I think there has been a failure of the human rights system to insist on the rights of minorities to free disposition of natural resources. It isn't a problem of international law. Where do we find these rights? We find them in Article 1, the very first article of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. They're in Article 1 of the International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights. And yet, when states report on their performance under these articles, they very rarely report on the right to free disposition over natural resources. The Human Rights Committee, which hears claims under the optional protocol to the International Covenant, has said it doesn't have the mandate to judge claims made under Article 1 because only individual claims are acceptable under its mandate, and Article 1 claims are about collective rights. Is that really good enough? The argument is sometimes made that those articles and those rights within them are only rights of colonized peoples. But just as with those other rights contained in Article 1, the right to self-determination of peoples, it should now be widely accepted that it doesn't just have an external aspect, but also an internal aspect. The right to free disposition over natural resources is not just a right of colonized peoples to be free from foreign exploitation. It is also a right for peoples within a state, including minorities and indigenous groups, to benefit from the natural resources that are found on their lands. And in that context, I'm particularly proud that Minority Rights Group joined with a Kenyan NGO, Semeride, in a landmark case before the African Commission on Human and People's Rights on the rights of the Indorowa people, a pastoralist community who in the 1970s were dispossessed of their lands around Lake Bogoria in Kenya by the government to make way for a game reserve. Earlier this year, the African Union approved the decision of the African Commission upholding the claim that their rights had been violated, ordering full restitution and compensation, and crucially, finding not just a violation of their right to development, but also their right to natural resources. Concessions had been granted to mining communities on that land from which the Indorowa had not benefited and on which they had not been consulted. We need more cases like that. We need to ensure that states report on Article 1 in their reports to the Human Rights Council under the Universal Periodic Review process. But for all that to happen, I think we need to ensure that a violation is called by its proper name. I would just draw your attention, as the final thing I say, to some of the language in which this dispossession is described. So we read, in cases in which minorities have lost land rights due to exploitation or to insufficient familiarity with national legal systems, measures should be put in place. Well, the recommendation is important, but I would ask you, imagine you're a citizen of Geneva and you're walking along the street and someone attacks you and steals your wallet. What do you say? How would that Geneva citizen react? Would they plead insufficient familiarity with their national legal system? Or would they say, "Au secours, voleur, voleur, stop, thief"? I think it's only when we really start to admit that this wholesale dispossession of minorities and indigenous peoples from their land is an act of theft, of robbery that goes on. Only when we admit that will the case for restitution become overwhelming.
Dalits make up approximately 25% of India's 1 billion plus population. They bear the brunt of the worst of Indian society and are considered untouchable and unclean because of the jobs they're forced to do according to the country's age-old caste system. They face atrocities and discrimination in all aspects of their lives, despite a raft of laws and affirmative action initiatives to protect them. Here, Paul Divakar, of the National Campaign for Dalit Human Rights, which is based in New Delhi, reveals to an audience at an event organised by UNICEF and MRG the details of the harsh daily discrimination faced by Dalit children at school.
In our work, we had come across quite a large amount of discrimination that is taking out on children, especially school-going children. And then we realized, India, you have a law for everything. And I respect my country. I mean, when you look at some of the other experiences, I mean, the fact that it's a democratic country, the fact you can speak against it, the fact that I can say here anything and then still travel freely in the country is a very respectable thing. But on the other hand, you have, at the drop of your hat, you have a law. And then we realized, how come you don't have a law to address the discrimination at that very level, at the school level? We had a public hearing in a state called Bihar. And then we had, from all over the state of Bihar, we had about 20 cases that activists and Dalit movements have brought together, instances of discrimination that they have faced in school. And it's so shocking, so appalling. And what are they? The cases range from severe corporal punishment. And what was that? Corporal punishment for using the glass that the teacher used, for taking water from the common pot for Dalits, for using toilets, because the teacher would say, how dare you use the toilets? Did your grandfather, grandmother have access to the toilets? You know, these toilets are not for you. You're only supposed to clean it. And so they locked a child up, a child who was in the first standard, less than around 5 years age, for the whole day that he fainted. And only when the parents found out, then the teacher said he had gone and they caught him, and then he was locked up in the toilet. Then we did a study in 4 states. We found 5 different types of concerns. Dalit children and their experience with the teachers. Dalit children with the children coming from the other caste. And then there is extreme forms of violence against Dalit children in the classroom, in the school ground, and in dining halls. What are the experiences of Dalit children with the teachers? Simple thing. I mean, classrooms, even all of us would remember some of the best experiences of our growth has come because one teacher has been, I have been a favorite pupil of one teacher. And then I would love her and have so many kind of imaginations with her, because that is a very protective age. But at that age, imagine that a teacher, many of them, I don't know whether they've realized it, they would not even care to look at the notebooks which have been given as homework, where all the children from the other communities would get a detailed remark how they should improve their handwriting, how they should do the spelling, how should do this. their books were untouched. And imagine the load a small child would carry. Nobody has done this assessment, the psychological impact of such discrimination which they would face. There is extra punishments for something which is very silly, for scolding them for not wearing uniforms, abusing them for not wearing clean clothes. What is the definition of a clean cloth? There is a mindset that as soon as you see a Dalit, then you are seeing cockroaches. You're not seeing human people. And so whatever you wear, they say, no, you're smelling, you're polluted, and this has come, and some either dirt because of their play, and then they would scold them, they would beat them and punish them extraordinarily compared to the non-Dalit children.
Finally, our minority music piece this month hails from the so-called Balkan Gypsy brass scene and has its roots in the Southeast and Central European Roma community. There are currently between 7 and 10 million Roma people in Europe, making them the largest minority in the region, who sadly face widespread public prejudice and official discrimination. Fanfare Ciocilia is a popular 12-piece Romani brass band from northeastern Romania. Their musical style stems primarily from the traditions of Romani and Romanian folk dance music, but they also borrow freely from Turkish, Bulgarian, Serbian and Macedonian musical styles. The song, which features Mitsu, a Roma singer from Hungary, is called Panakand Nu Te Iubeam.
So